Okay, hey everyone. So here's the final part of our Cinema 4D course where we're just going to be tweaking a couple things and setting up our render so we can export a really nice looking image into After Effects or Photoshop, whatever your compositing software is for final finishing touches. So here, let's just go over a couple render settings and also a couple more things that we can tweak to finish up the image with lighting and any other last minute things that we'd like to change now that we've got the lighting and texturing and all that stuff set up. So first thing I want to do is actually just tweak the lighting around a little bit. So I think I might want to move around our lights just a bit in our scene. And this is all just personal preference. I think I'd rather have a front light over here. And that actually has to do with something that I haven't mentioned yet, which is the GI. So once we turn this on, this is going to really change the look of our scene. So let me just set up our lights in a different configuration here. I think I'd rather have this light around the back. This area, and maybe I want to bring this light. Oh, not do that. Just want to bring it over here to the side. And this is just going to change the look of our lights just a bit. And just want to angle this a bit more towards our character here. Okay. And then over here in the GI, so our scene looks pretty good right now, but what's really going to make it look super realistic or help at least a little bit is changing the GI settings. So under render settings, as well as you can find it up here, but I've got it docked in my menu. So we can just turn on our different render engines. So there's an irradiance point cache and a brute force. So primary GI engine always set to brute force, and then the secondary one, depending on what you are speed wise, you can go from irradiance point cloud, which is a little bit faster, to something like brute force. So for a still image that we're working on here, I'll typically use brute force, and I'll just kick the number of GI bounces up to something like 4 or 5 typically works fine for me. And then let's just keep the brute force GI rays down at 16 for now. And then a couple of other things we can do in the optimization tab. There's a hair min pixel width. And so let's just turn that on, and then one more hair setting under system, which is hair tessellation. And now these two things in conjunction can really help with the realism of the hair. It can thin it out, so it's really fine, and also gives you a bit of tessellation here, which is similar to how we work with Redshift object tags and subdividing the geometry. It's just going to subdivide these hairs and help us smooth those out a little bit. Okay. So let's just hit render, and we can see what our GI settings and our new lighting setup have changed. Yeah, so something like this to me is pretty interesting. Got the strong shadow here. Maybe we want to bring it a little bit more this way. So that light is pointed towards the eye here. But maybe we get the shadow to be a bit more behind the character. So more like the flash is coming directly from the camera. Yeah, that looks good to me. And then we've actually brightened up our scene quite a bit and warmed it up also by using our GI settings here. So if I just turn this off, this updates, you'll be able to see. There's a bit more contrast in this and has more of a gray tone down here in the shadows. So by just turning this on, it acts more like real life, where light will be bouncing off of all these surfaces and bouncing around the scene, filling out some of these darker areas. So you can see. Just put this to brute force. And then we can also turn our environment on again. See how that affects the scene. And again, that's just giving us that atmosphere more things for the light to catch. And at this point, we can also check out some of the Redshift post effects. So that's under here. We've already messed with the color management a bit earlier on, but there's also things like a LUT, there's the color controls, and I just want to look at photographic exposure first. So we can just see how this affects it when you turn it on. And I like that this gives you a bit more control of your image after the fact to really tweak things and get a more photographic looking image. So maybe we just want to adjust some of these settings. Bring this up a little bit. Can darken our scene just a touch. And we can also crush our blacks here if you wanted to. Just help with a bit of contrast. Okay. And then we can also use a LUT. And a LUT is essentially just a color correction file that is going to apply a global look, a global adjustment to our image. And I always want to apply the color management before the LUT. It always works out best for me when going into After Effects. And then we can try a bunch of these different LUT settings. So some of them can be really strong, really drastic, and might not be suitable. But there's other ones that we can use, something like the Canon DSC-1. I'll use this one a lot. It provides a really nice brightening to the image, and if you keep it pretty subtle, it doesn't affect things too much. So yeah, so something like that. It's looking good to me. And then once you're happy with this image here, if you want to frame up the camera a little differently, you can do that now. And then we also want to look at our basic render settings. So down here in the unified sampling, this is the overall samples for the image, and typically you'll want to set this up last, adjusting this. I know, for example, that our image is going to need at least 256 for this, and especially once you have the environment on, this can really affect the amount of samples that you need, the environment object, I mean. We also have sample overrides down here. Now, this lets you just override a specific sample. So for the reflections, so just this part, so if this was really noisy and the rest of the image was clean, you could just bump this up. Subsurface scattering and environments or volumes can often take quite a long time to clean up noise-wise. So I generally have these a bit higher than my other settings. So let's try something like that. Hopefully that'll give us a clean image. You can also boost up your brute force GI rays as well. And we're really looking for quality here. If you were working on a motion piece or something like that, you would really need to dial this in and do a lot of iterations on your render settings to try and calculate the fastest time that you can get for your render time. But for our purposes, we don't really need that. We can also crank up this adaptive error to 2.005. And then something else we can do to increase the amount of GI bounce that we have here is we can go into our individual light settings here and go to the rays, and we can also just kick up this GI to 0.5. That's just going to increase the amount of bounce for our lights. Okay. All right, so that's essentially all we need to do for this stuff here. So next up, we need to set up our UVs. Now, these are going to be the individual parts of the image that we're going to save out so that we can use those in After Effects for some additional control with compositing. So you can either save it out as a multi-party XR, which will combine all of the layers into one image, or you can just keep this unchecked and it will kick out a bunch of different versions. So let's just do that. So down here in the AOV manager, if you just click on this, I'll show you all the available AOVs on the left here. And this is the space where you put them. So you just click and drag these over. Okay. So the beauty is just a combination of all of these. It'll look like this, essentially. And we've got a couple checkboxes here. We just want to make sure we click on direct. Click on our beauty. And what we're going to use is light groups. So you can see over here we've got all light groups. So we don't have any yet. So what we need to do is go into our lights right here. And we need to assign these to different light groups. So let's click on our dome light, go to attributes, and we've got this tab for light group here. So where it says AOV light group none, we want to go down and add a new one. So we can just call this dome. And we'll go through here and give these a 1, a 2, and a 3. And this is just going to give us a lot of control once we get into After Effects to isolate different parts of our lighting setup. So we can dim some down, increase the intensity of some, or even change the color of a certain light group. So once we've got those set up in our object tags or on our light objects, we want to go to Beauty. And we just want to check all light groups, and that's going to save out each one as a separate piece. Okay. And then some other images available AOVs that we want to use are maybe something like reflections and specular lighting. We can preview those up here. So we just hit render. And then in this drop down up here where it says beauty, we can select the different things that we've created. So this is our reflection pass, specular lighting pass, and then we have our different light groups here. So some subtle lighting, and then here's our just basic ambient dome light. And back to our beauty. Okay. And then one more that I use a lot, can be really useful for fine control and compositing, is the puzzle mat. So let's just drop that over here, switch it to direct. And then over here you'll see we've got a mode, and this can either be materials or object ID. So material would be separating each piece by the material that it has, whatever is down here in your material palette. But we want to use object ID. And in order to enable this, we need to set up some IDs. So for our background here, so these 3 cubes that we have, we've got one tag, and we just want to go over the Object ID tab, hit override, and we just want to set this one to 1. Now that's to separate out the background. So if we wanted to have a transparent background with our character floating in space, we could do that using this puzzle map. So let's make some other ones. So let's just drag up another OBJ tag up here, and we're just going to give this a value of 2. And then for all of the objects that we have in our garment section, we are going to override and give them a value of 2. And that way, all of our garments are going to be exported out into one pass, so we can just edit that specifically. And then maybe we want to do that for our character as well, the body. So on the object ID here, we can just set this one to 3. And you can keep all of these in one puzzle mat section. So we've got red, green, and blue. So we just do 1, 2, 3 in this area. And then you can also, if you have reflections or refractions in your scene, you can click this on. We don't really need that right now as we're not doing any sort of glass transparency or anything like that. So in order to preview this, it doesn't show up if you're using progressive mode, the progressive rendering mode. So we will need to switch this over to bucket rendering. That'll give you an idea of what we're actually creating with the puzzle map. Okay, there we go. So we switch this over to puzzle map here. Make sure we're in bucket rendering mode. And you can see it's starting to appear here rather slowly. Let me just pause this, restart. So what we should have is we should have a green mat that covers our garment. We should have a blue one for the skin, and we should have a red one that occupies this outer area, the walls of our scene. It's not cooperating here. Oh, there we go. It's just taking some time. So bucket rendering is for the highest quality, which is what the final image will be rendered as. Checking this off goes into progressive mode, which is a much quicker but much rougher and takes a longer time to get to a noiseless image. So that's why we typically work in progressive when we're just doing look dev. But you can see as it starts to clean this up, we're getting a division between these two colors here. So once this finishes, you'll have a full image of colors, and we'll look at that once we get into After Effects and use it to tweak a couple things. Okay, so let's just turn this off for now. And now that we've got all of our AOVs set up, we've got our render settings set up, we are good to go. So we just need to set up an export here. We can just save a PNG. Our EXRs are going to be exported as well. So let's just save out a reference for us. So let's call this $PRJ. So this is a render token. And what this is going to do is it's going to create a PNG image when this finishes rendering that has the same name as our project file. And something cool that you can do with this is you can do $PRJ again, and that's going to create a folder inside of our render folder with the same name as our project file, and then save a PNG into that folder with the same name as our project file. So using these render tokens is a great way to set up your scene so you don't have to keep changing this output path every time you version up or save a new file. Okay, so let's just save this. And then we can go ahead and hit render, and then we'll see how everything turns out.